With World War II, however, everything changed. So Britain had been preeminent. Some of the other major countries had been France and Italy and Germany and Japan and the United States. Well, France had been occupied by the Germans. There had been a whole lot of fighting in France. Germany, Italy, and Japan had all been pretty well devastated by the Allied forces and were, in many cases, in ruins. And the United Kingdom of Great Britain, which managed to hold off and was never successfully invaded by the Axis powers, was still pounded by the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, and a lot of their major cities also were practically in rubble. Beyond that, their forces had been stretched very thin all around the world, right? Because they're not just there in Britain, they're having to occupy all those colonies and all those other areas where they had to protect their interests. So those areas had been taken by the Germans or the Japanese for the most part. So the United Kingdom of Great Britain is not nearly in the same kind of shape at the end of World War II that it was in at the beginning of World War II, nor was it damaged anywhere near as badly in World War I as it was in World War II. So, out of all those major countries, and then you throw in the Soviet Union there, I forgot to mention them, they too had been invaded. They hadn't suffered as much damage in the interior of their country because the Germans didn't get that far, but they still had huge losses, probably outside of the Axis powers, the largest losses of any Allied country. And then you've got the United States, which the United States did lose a lot of military personnel. The casualties were higher than I think any war other than the American Civil War, but still proportionately compared to the countries that were sort of at ground zero in the fighting, nowhere near as bad. No actual fighting in the United States other than that attack on Pearl Harbor. In addition to that, the country had mobilized in a big way, and it's a big country, and created this really huge military. And they had ended the war, of course, with the atomic bomb, and no one else at that point had it. So the United States, at the end of World War II, is now the superpower, the preeminent world power. And it dominated the world economy, which is, one sign of a hegemony. New York City replaced London as the world's leading banking and economic center. In fact, about a quarter of a century later, they started building these two huge buildings in downtown Manhattan called the World Trade Center. Also, and we talked about this when we discussed World War I and the end of it not too long ago, at the conference at Bretton Woods, the U.S. dollar replaced the British pound as the global currency. So there at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, at that conference, there was a big shift away from the United Kingdom of Great Britain and toward the U.S. economically, just as there had been a shift away from Great Britain and toward the U.S. militarily. As mentioned before, hegemonies require a free flow of goods, as well as capital and currency. Now that's because hegemony is part of a world system of capitalism. So it's ultimately largely about economics and trade. And what that means is that once a country gets hegemony, they absolutely have to protect their national interests all around the world. Now, you still hear people today complain about the United States acting as the world's policeman. Why do we have to be the world's policeman? Why can't we mind our own business? Well, the United States wasn't the world's policeman before the end of World War II. They were pretty isolationist, other than the fact that under Teddy Roosevelt and then Taft and Wilson, we were the hemispheric policemen. But things change once you get hegemony, because the hegemony requires the constant cycling of goods of the system that you are now on top of. So that's true all around the world, not just in your country. And you have to make sure, if you're going to maintain that hegemony, that there aren't any kinks in that flow. And that's why hegemonies, whether you're talking about the United States post-World War II or Britain pre-World War II, hegemonies oppose nationalism. Now, not in their own country, of course. Nationalism in other countries, especially second world countries and third world countries, that are kind of in a subservient position to the hegemony in the whole system of things. So by nationalism, I don't just mean being proud of your country or your group. Nationalism here defined as self-determination. That is, a country making their own decisions about, about their resources in particular. Extremely nationalist country. Now, we talked a lot about nationalism connected with fascism, but that's just the most extreme form. You can be nationalist without being fascist. But a nationalist nation may be more inclined to be isolationist because they want to make their own decisions. So they don't want to be hooked in to the global system as much as a country that was not isolationist. Also, a country or a people that had a big surge of nationalism might do things while looking out for their own interest first that imperil the national interests of the hegemon. And we're going to look at some examples of how that happened post-World War II with the United States. I'm going to leave this slide up for just a few seconds so that you can come back and pause on it if you want to remember these names and how to spell them. But we're going to be looking at some images while I talk about them. Let's take a look first at Iran, formerly known as Persia. Iran/Persia had long been ruled by kings. The king was referred to as the Shah, which is Persian for king. Actually, the full title is Shah-an-Shah, which means King of Kings. Now, if you'll recall, when we were talking about the end of World War II, I mentioned how the English, the British had gone into Iran along with the Soviets, their allies at the time, in order to protect the oil fields from the Nazis. Well, the Nazis wanted the oil, the Allies wanted the oil. The Iranians had the oil, right? They were there. It was their country. Essentially, the British/Soviets, the Allies, deposed the Shah because he wasn't playing ball, and instead instated his son, Reza Pahlavi, as the new Shah. That wasn't the end of the war. That was near the beginning of the war in 1941. Okay, so the Shah of Iran, Reza Pahlavi. Country also had a parliament, and parliaments have prime ministers. Well, the king was pretty powerful, and a lot of Iranian people believed that this particular Shah was corrupt. Mohammad Mossadegh, that's the older gentleman here in the photograph being grabbed. Mohammad Mossadegh was a member of parliament, and he was elected prime minister of the Iranian parliament in July 1952. And when he took office, when he took over, he went in some new directions. One of the new directions was that he moved to nationalize the Iranian oil industry. What does that mean? That means that it would be controlled by the government of Iran, and by extension, the people of Iran, not by foreign investors. And who had been in control? Well, the British. In fact, there's a company called British Petroleum, BP. Maybe you've heard of them. So not only the British, but also other European powers had really been sort of taking over the oil industry and taking a lot of those profits out of the country and back to the European countries, right? So Mossadegh moved to nationalize the oil industry and cut all those non-Iranians out. As you can imagine, the British were not too happy about that, nor were any of their European and American allies. Also not happy, the Shah, because he had been put in place due to the fact that he had promised to play nice with the British and essentially give them what they want. As this started to get more tense, with the European powers being very upset about this move towards socialism, there also was tension between Mossadegh and the Shah. And Mossadegh used the office of prime minister to limit the power of the Shah, or the king, curtail his power significantly. All right, well, what's going to be done about this? The United States and Great Britain, but it was primarily a U.S. operation, sent operatives to Iran, CIA from the U.S. and MI6 from Britain. But again, it was mostly a CIA operation to engineer a coup d'etat, a coup to overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh, who had been democratically elected. They overthrew him and put in instead the member of parliament that they supported, who was going to do the things that they wanted, which included let them have the oil, right? Mossadegh was arrested. Here you can see in the picture, and he was sentenced to 3 years of solitary confinement, followed by house arrest for the rest of his life, which is 15 more years. And when they said house arrest, they weren't kidding. When he died, he wasn't allowed to have a funeral. They buried him in his living room. Anyway, Mossadegh had had the support of a lot of the people. He was very popular. He also had the support of the Islamic scholars and clerics in the country, including Ayatollah Kashani, one of the foremost of those scholars. And he was democratically elected. So once he is overthrown and removed, essentially by the CIA, all those powers that he had kind of stripped from the Shah get returned, and then some. The Shah is much more powerful after this. And so far as a lot of the people in Iran are concerned, a lot harder to get along with. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this part of history in the late 1970s, but you know there was a revolution in Iran in 1979 by Islamic fundamentalists led by an Ayatollah, right? And they overthrew the Shah, who at that time had cancer. Same guy, same Shah, and he had come to the U.S. for treatment. And then the country gets overthrown, and this new government is not very friendly with the United States. They took a bunch of U.S. citizens hostage at the embassy, and there was a long standoff on that. And if you were here in the U.S. watching the news, you really didn't have a clear idea, unless you knew your history, what everybody was so upset about. The way it was presented by American politicians, for the most part, was those people in Iran, they hate freedom. They hate America because they hate freedom. But in reality, a lot of that, most of that probably stemmed from this incident in the 1950s when the democratically elected leader of Iran was overthrown by the American CIA. Now let's take a look at Guatemala. In the 1930s, Guatemala was ruled by a military dictator named Jorge Ubico, who took office in 1931, succeeding another military dictator. When he came into office, there was a large amount of public land in Guatemala. Public land is land that is not privately owned, but is administered by the government. Most of that public land had been taken away in the previous century from the local indigenous people, many of whom were Mayans. So all this land that was taken from Indians, Ubico passed several very repressive laws related to labor, including a policy of basically forcing Indians to do manual labor for the government without compensation. He also passed a law that said that if you were of working age and you didn't own land, you had to perform a minimum of 100 days of hard labor each year for the government. And it actually wasn't usually for the government. They were farmed out to plantations, including banana plantations. United Fruit Company, which was an American company, had a huge operation in Guatemala. Today they're known as Chiquita Bananas. In fact, by the 1950s, the United Fruit Company had their profits each year were twice as high as the income of the Guatemalan government. So they were very powerful, and they had supported this guy Ubico in taking over the country. In return, he gave them 490,000 acres of public land. Again, that was land that was taken from the Indians. He also had a law that essentially allowed landowners complete immunity from prosecution for anything that they did in protection of their property, which could be interpreted however they or the government wanted. Essentially what it meant was that if you were a worker and you caused any trouble or offered any resistance, you could be executed legally by the landowners. Well, 1944, this guy was overthrown by a popular revolution, and Guatemala became, instead of a military dictatorship, it became a democracy with democratic elections. So they had one president who was one of the leaders of the revolution. Then in 1951, he was replaced by Jacobo Arbenz, who had been a general in the revolution against the dictator. And Arbenz took over, and his policies included, some very socialist things. He supported leftist groups. One of the things that he did was, a lot of the things he did hampered the United Fruit Company. He took back a large amount of that land that had been given freely by the dictator to the United Fruit Company. Passed a law that said any public land or any land that is not being cultivated is public land. And the United Fruit Company was actually only using 15% of that 500,000 acres. They were planning to use the rest of it, I guess, forever. But that was taken back and redistributed and given. The land was given to poor families, most of them indigenous people who had no land, and 500,000 people got lands and homes because of this. He also reversed all those labor laws and cracked down on the abuse of workers. He further actually supported unions, unionized workers who were striking, particularly in the United Fruit Company plantations. Well, as you can imagine, United Fruit Company not real happy about all of this, and they complained to the United States government, right? Look what's going on down here. Our honest efforts to make a dollar are being impeded by these dadgum communists, which, we'll be talking later about the U.S. efforts to curb communism around the world. But essentially, what Arbenz was doing is the same thing that Mossadegh was doing. They may have had socialist leanings, but they were primarily nationalists who were looking after their own people's interests and their own country's interests above the interests of outsiders who had come in and essentially taken control. So what happened? The CIA engineered a coup, overthrowing Arbenz and putting in his place a dictator, another dictator who would be in place, he and his successors. It would be a dictatorship thereafter for decades, and many, untold thousands of people were killed during this repressive dictatorship. And in fact, they had genocidal policies against the indigenous people. No one even can say how many of them were killed. And anybody who supported the rights of workers or of the people during that period were likely to end up dead. There's two. That's 1954 that happened. Now let's take a look at Chile. In 1970, this guy was elected president of Chile, Salvador Allende. He was a Marxist. He had a close relationship with Fidel Castro. He was, in fact, the first Marxist to be democratically elected in a South American country. Now, the other guy that we talked about before, Arbenz, kind of had leftist leanings, socialist leanings, but wasn't a Marxist. This guy was a Marxist, and it was the 1970s, so the Cold War is going strong. So you can imagine how the United States felt about him being in charge of a country in the Western Hemisphere. Answer: they didn't like it at all. So, to the surprise of no one, the State Department and the CIA, under the direction of Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, backed a coup, which overthrew Salvador Allende and ended with him dead, and replaced him with this guy, General Augusto Pinochet, who was, I know it's kind of hard to guess by looking at him, a brutal dictator who was in charge for the next 20 years, one of the most repressive governments in South America. Over 3,000 people were either executed or disappeared during that time. Essentially, again, just like in Guatemala, anybody who was a dissident, anyone who was complaining of the government was liable to just disappear. By the way, if you are familiar with the TV shows Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul, then you're familiar with this guy, this character, Gustavus Fring, who's the main villain in those shows, a cold-blooded, cruel, evil drug lord, who is, the character is supposed to be from Chile, and it is heavily implied that he had been a high-ranking officer in Pinochet's death squads. So just to kind of give you a cultural touchstone and reference point, they're making a TV show, and they want to have a villain who is so evil and scary that he scares drug lords and cartels. What are they going to do to kind of instantly convey that? Hey, let's have him be a guy who worked for Pinochet, and that gives you an idea of really just well, how cruel and evil that whole administration was. I also mentioned in that list earlier the Sandinistas and Contras in Nicaragua in the 1980s. That is a very complex and complicated story that I will go into in much greater detail when we get to the 1980s. It wound up being part of a huge political scandal for Ronald Reagan, but just quickly to set the stage for that, the Sandinistas were the group that were in charge in Nicaragua, led by Daniel Ortega, who was the president of Nicaragua. They were Marxists. They had actually overthrown the previous military dictator and established a new government. However, there were rebels who were anti-Marxist, Contras, or counter, as in counter-revolutionaries, who were trying to rise up and now overthrow the Marxists that overthrew the dictator. And Ronald Reagan authorized the CIA to start arming, training, and equipping the rebels who were fighting against the Marxist government there. And it became, as I said, it involved ultimately El Salvador and Honduras and Oliver North and a whole lot of scandal. But essentially, you get the idea of what it was all, what was behind it all. And that was the U.S. efforts to suppress socialism, communism, but beyond that, to suppress, well, what were ultimately nationalist movements. So just like with Mossadegh and with Arbenz, these folks' primary focus was controlling the destiny of their own country rather than outside countries controlling it for them. And this all ties in with our overall discussion of hegemony, because that is the sort of thing that when you are the hegemonic power, you don't want to have happen if you're going to keep that hegemonic position and keep those goods flowing.